Okay, so we're going to talk about relative hyperlinks within the web page. Okay, so prior to this, we were mainly linking using URLs or just a single file name to link pages. So we'll talk about how to do that when you have multiple folders within a directory. We'll talk about configuring hyperlink within like a single page, okay, and how to move around on the page using links. Talk about CSS Sprites, then 3-column layout using CSS. We'll talk about how to set up a style sheet for printing, and then we'll get into mobile design, and we'll talk about how we're going to set up our pages with some specific code to get them to look correctly on the mobile screen. We'll also talk about flex boxes, okay, and grid layout. Okay, first, let's talk about our linking, okay? So like I said before, we're primarily either setting up that href with a specific URL, okay? So like where we add in HTTP / www, whatever the URL is. Or we were putting all of our files in one folder and then just linking to an HTML file directly within that folder, which is pretty easy because then you just have to, for the href, you just list that file name. Okay, so let's look at what they have here. We have a folder, we can just call it our main folder called Casita, and within that folder we have 3 additional folders. Okay, so we have one called images, we have one called rooms, and then we have one called events. Okay, within each of those 3 folders, we also have some HTML files, and then in our image folder, we have our images. Okay, within that main folder of Casita, we have our index.html and our contact.html, as well as our style sheet. All right, so what if we wanted to, so we're in our code, right? We're in our, say we're in our index.html page, and we're working on our nav, and we need to link to that canyon.html page, okay? So how we're gonna do that, if you look there in the href, okay, so here on the screen, that second line, or the third line down, we have our opening a tag, and we have href, and then in our quotes there, we have rooms/canyon.html. All right, so what that's telling the browser is, what it's telling it to do is go to, so right now we're in index.html, right? So we're on the home page. It's telling that browser to go find the rooms folder. Okay, so that's the first part of the code there. And then we put in our backslash, okay? So that's kind of like telling it to go ahead and open that folder. And then within that folder, we find canyon.html, all right? So we have to put the name of the folder, we call them directories sometimes in web development, and then we put the name of the file. All right, so, but what if we're, so now imagine we're coding that canyon.html web page, right? So we're in our code and we need to link back to the home page. Okay, so that home page, it's not inside that rooms folder, it's inside that main Casita folder, right? So we have to kind of backtrack. We have to move back out, this kind of way to think about it. Okay, so to do that, what we do is, if you notice on the second part here in that first href line, where we put our link, we have 2 periods and then the / index.html. All right, so what those 2 periods do is they tell the browser to go ahead and move back out 1 step. Okay, so we're in rooms folder, it's telling it to move back 1 step into the Casita folder, and then open that index.html file, all right? Same thing there. So for example, if we're in the Canyon page and we need to link to one of the files in the events folder. Okay, so we want to go to weekend.html. We need to code that. It's the same thing. First, we tell it to move back out of that folder. Okay, so we use the 2 periods. Then we have our backslash. But then, like in the first part there, we need to tell it to now that we're back in the main directory, we need to tell it to open that events folder. And then once that's open, go to that weekend.html file. Okay. So we'll do some practice coding on this on Wednesday. So you can kind of see how this works with the actual code. But this is a good slide and example there to kind of give you an idea of how that works when we're talking about relative linking, all right? So fragment identifiers, okay, so this is like if you're on a web page, and you've probably seen some where it says, it has a link to a certain topic or something on that page. At the top of the page, and you click on it, and it basically kind of scrolls the page down. All right, and then a lot of times it'll have a link down below where in that content it says go back to top of the page or click back to top. All right, so we're using fragment identifiers. Okay, so there's 2 components. There's that element that identifies the name of the fragment of the page. All right, so the example here is we have a part of the page with an ID selector called top, all right? And then, so we would have that div set up there at the top of the page, okay? So just picture that as kind of our, the main content at the very top of the page that we're working on. And then if we have a link maybe down towards the bottom of the page and we need to get it to go back up to that top section, if you notice the ahref, how we have that set up is we use that hashtag and then top. Okay, so we're telling it to go to that ID selector, and what it'll do is move that browser back up to where that that ID selector starts, where that div starts on the page. Okay, so we can use these to kind of move around on pages. Another thing you might want to do is if you have a site and you want to open up like a link to a third-party website or something, and you might want to open it up into a new browser tab. Okay, what you can do is set up an additional section here in your anchor element link. So example here, we want to open up yahoo.com, right? But we want it to open in a different browser tab. What we can add in there after that first section there with the href is we add another piece called target equals and then underscore blank, right? And then we have Yahoo, which is the text part of the browser that'll be linked. And what that target equals, what that does is it tells the browser to basically open up a blank browser tab and then load that URL into that tab. Okay. We can also link whole sections of a page. Okay, so for example, we want to maybe we have an H1 and some paragraph text, and we want that entire thing to be linked to when somebody clicks on either the title or that text, that section, it'll open up a link. We can do that. We can just basically what we're doing is we're embedding that H1 and the paragraph element inside of our anchor tags there. Okay, so we have our first part, the ahref equals, and we have your URL or your relative link, whatever it might be, and that's our opening tag. And then before we add in the closing anchor tag, then we put in our H1 and our paragraph sections. And then we wrap that with that closing anchor tag, right? So that whole thing there would be linked. Another common thing that you'll be doing with modern web development, web design is linking like telephone numbers on a web page, right? Because a lot of times people are browsing sites with their phones. and you might want them to be able to just click on a phone number that's in the browser window and have it open up their either their the phone app on the phone, or the text message app. Okay, so we can do that again. So we have our Ahref. So the first one here is if we wanted to open up the phone app. The link that we use there, we do TEL : and then the phone number. And then, so then we have the text that's going to load up in the mobile browser, right? It says call 888-555. And then by using that TEL : it's going to turn that into a link that when the phone browser knows that when it's clicked, it needs to go ahead and open up the default phone app. And then the same thing with text message. Okay, we can, instead of using TEL : we just use SMS : and then the phone number. And then when they click on that, it'll pull up their text message, whatever the default text message app is installed on the phone. All right. So again, these are things that you'll probably do quite a bit with our modern web pages that we're developing, because most of the time people are looking at our sites on the phone. Okay. All right, so CSS Sprites. Okay, so Sprite, what that means is we have, so if you've ever gone to a site and it might have a menu button or something where you like roll over that menu button, and that menu button might have an image kind of associated to it or tied to it. And maybe that image changes color, or it's changes the shading of it, something like that. We can do that by using a sprite graphic, okay? So what that sprite is it's basically two versions of that image that we want to show in the button. And what we do is we only load one image. And then we just, in our CSS and our coding, we can tell the browser to move that image up and down within that space allotted. Okay, so like when we use a hover, say like last week, we worked on those pseudo classes, like the hover. We can tell it when it hovers that it's going to move that, that background image down. And then it gives the illusion that we've basically loaded a different image in there during the hover state. Okay, so, but we're only using one image. Okay, so the reason we do this, it just saves on download time. The browser only has to download one image file instead of two files. Okay, so that's something we'll practice as well. All right, our three-column page layout. Okay, so this is kind of our standard three-column layout, and we use this primarily for desktop browser pages. Okay, a lot of times we're going to have a header across the top. We're typically going to have a nav section on the left side that is vertical, and then we have our main section. And then we'll use that aside element that we kind of worked on a little bit at the end of the coding activities last week. Okay, so we'll do some more work with this with this three-column layout, just because it's a pretty common standard layout that we use in web design. All right, and just some kind of best practices for coding this. We'll use a container that has everything inside of it, has our header, nav, main, footer, all that good stuff. We'll have a container, and then we'll set up our left column navigation section with a float left. Then we'll usually assign a pixel width to it. So for example, this one's 150. For our the right side, okay, so that sidebar, we'll use that aside element. We'll float it to the right. Again, we'll assign a pixel width to it. The center column will just take up whatever's remaining within that space. Okay, but with that center column, we'll usually go ahead and set some margins, okay, for our top, bottom, and then our left and right. Okay, so for example, this one has 0 pixel margins on the top, and then we have our 210 and 160s pixels for the other sides. And then a lot of times we'll set up our footer and we'll use that float clear code. Okay, so we'll use that clear both. Okay, so it basically ignores those floats that we've had set up on our side sections. So with style sheets, kind of the really cool thing about them is that we can have multiple style sheets for different purposes for our web pages. Okay, so for example, we could have a style sheet for that's specifically set for the mobile screens. Okay, in this example here, we can have a separate style sheet for the page if somebody wants to print that web page. Okay, so if they're on their computer and they want to print off the page, we can have a separate style sheet for printing. And the reason we do that is we can strip out some of the kind of the unnecessary elements of that page. So for example, a lot of times people don't need the navigation bars or anything like that when they're printing. They're primarily printing for the content that's on the page. Okay, so in our head section, we can actually link 2 different style sheets. Okay, we would, in this example here, we have wildflower.css, which is our main style sheet for what they're seeing on the screen. The only thing that we're adding here, so you notice we have a third property there within this element. We're adding media equals. Okay, so that first one we're telling it's for the screen, right? So we're going to use that style sheet when we're on our screen, when we're on the digital the digital screen on the computer. Then we have our second one there. Again, we're using external style sheets. Okay. So this one we have it saved differently. It's a different name. We're loading up a wildflower print.css, and there in the media equals print. The reason we put that is because when you hit the print command on your computer, that CSS, the browser realizes that you're now printing, so it's going to go ahead and load up a different style sheet. And then we'll do some of this in our coding activities, and you'll see how we kind of strip out some of the elements for that printing version of the style sheet. Okay, so we'll, for example, we'll hide the nav. Okay, we do that by using the display none code there. We can configure the fonts and the colors differently for printing. Okay, we could just make it black text with a white background because people don't want to print off like a colored background. So we'll do that. We can control the page breaks, and we can print URLs for hyperlinks. Okay, so like for example, if we had a hyperlink on there that said, you know, whatever, it's click here for the best barbecue recipes. Instead of showing that, we could actually show the URL for that. So when they print it off, the user could have a reference to what that URL is on print. Okay, all right, so next section. Let's talk about the web for mobile screens. So these are some of the limitations that we need to think about when we're designing for the web. One thing that I always tell students is in today's age, we're always designing for the web on a mobile screen first. Okay, most people, a good large percentage of people are kind of just by default, they're going to web pages on their phones because of the, it's easy. They always have their phone with them. It's accessible. So we need to make sure that all of our pages look and perform really well on that mobile screen size, okay? So as far as limitations, we have to think about, we have a smaller screen size, right? So we can't fit everything on there as like we would on a browser desktop screen, okay? Most likely it's going to be a little bit lower bandwidth unless they're on Wi-Fi, but if they're out just on their cellular band, sometimes you might hit low bandwidth, you might be in that 3G range where it takes a little bit longer to load the page. Fonts are going to be a little more limited on the mobile screen. Colors could be a little bit limited just depending on the phone that you have. Most of the modern Android and iPhone technology has really good color, but some of the older smartphones might have a little bit of a limited color palette, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. And with our smartphones, it's pretty much all touch and multi-touch gestures, okay? So we're just pushing and on the buttons, okay? So we don't have hovers and all that stuff like we do on a desktop, okay? Because we're not using a cursor and a mouse. We're just using the touch screens. And then lack of flash. This is kind of, at some point, we probably won't even talk about Flash anymore. But a lot of pages used to have Flash plugins, okay, for like more interactive type content. Apple kind of killed that with the iPhone. They didn't support Flash, and that was kind of the dagger for Flash. So phones don't support Flash, but they still support a lot of our HTML5, JavaScript, CSS, all that stuff. So Flash isn't much of a big deal anymore. And then they're probably going to have a little bit limited processor and memory compared to high-end laptop. Remember, some people might not have the unlimited data plans. Okay, so if you have a mobile site and you have really large file sizes, okay, they have to download all that content. It's taking up some of their data usage. So just something to kind of keep in mind. So this is a website that the W3C best practices for mobile web design. Okay, we want to optimize our layout, navigation, graphics, and text for mobile use. All right. And we want to use design for one web, right? And what that means is all of our pages, HTML pages that we're designing, we're only designing those one time, but we're using CSS and JavaScript, things like that. We're using that to transform what the page looks like with different screen sizes, okay? But we only develop basically one web page. All right, so when we're using phones, most likely we're going to have a single column layout, right? There's just not enough space to have 2 or 3 columns. Sometimes we might have 2 columns, but if somebody's using a smaller smartphone, it's not going to work real great. So most of the time we're going to use a 1 column layout where we have our nav. It's kind of in that, for the example here, we have that nav kind of in the first part there under the header. And then we use, it's going to scroll basically in just one direction. One thing we never want to do is have our users have to scroll horizontally. Okay, so left and right. on the phone. That's just bad practice. We want them to just be able to scroll up and down, okay, vertically. So we're using heading elements, we're using lists. We don't want to use tables, okay, because if we're using tables, it's going to make that, the mobile browser is going to load that and we'll have to scroll left and right. So we don't want to use tables. We use divs primarily. Avoid using pixel units in our style sheets. Okay, so for our mobile screen style sheets, we're going to use probably percentages, things like that instead of pixels, because we have so many different mobile screen sizes out there, different phones. We don't want to use absolute positioning. Okay, we want to have it be flexible, and we want to hide some of that content that's really not essential for mobile use. Okay, so let's take a look here real quick. I'll try to load an example. Let's load up the K-State page. Let's see here. So let's go to KSU.edu. All right, so we have, this is for the desktop screen, right? So we have this kind of cool video that plays. We have a multiple column layout, right? We've got lots of photos. Okay, so let's go ahead and take this down to the mobile screen size. All right, so I shrunk my browser screen. Okay, so now we're down to what you would typically see on the mobile. All right, so we have one column. We have our menu here. Okay, so vertical menu. And all of those graphics that we had for the calendar, we're now in one column. Okay, and we're just scrolling vertically. We don't have to really scroll left and right for anything because the CSS is redoing the layout to let everything kind of flow in one column. All right. So you'll notice too, we kind of hit different points. Okay, so say you pull this up on like a small tablet, so like a small iPad. We have the video that we're loading up, but we still have the vertical menu like we did in the mobile. But we have two columns now instead of one column. All right, but you notice when we're in the mobile version for the phone, we lose that video. Okay, so just because it's kind of unnecessary. I mean, it's a nice marketing piece, but overall it's going to take up too much bandwidth for mobile screen size. The video is going to get real tiny. Okay, so we don't really need to show that. So we basically hide that content for the mobile. And then if we scroll back out, okay, now we're back out to our desktop view. Okay. So, whoops, sorry, let's find where it was. Sorry, okay. All right, so so talking about that navigation, right? We want minimal navigation towards the top of the screen, okay? Usually with this, we want to avoid we want to avoid hyperlinks that open files in new windows. Okay, when you're on the mobile browsers, it's going to open up a new window. Okay, so if we can, we want to avoid those, and we want to balance both the number of hyperlinks and the number of levels needed to access the information. So, thinking back to we're talking about sitemaps. Okay, you got to kind of take that into account. So as far as our graphics for mobile use, right, we want to avoid using images that are wider than the screen. Okay, so here in a few slides, we'll talk about how to automatically resize images for like a mobile screen. We we want to usually try to avoid images that have text in them, okay? Because we're a lot of times shrinking those photos and graphics down, okay? So sometimes if you have some text in there, it might not be readable when it's really small. And we want to specifically specify the sizes of the images that we use. As far as text, for mobile, make sure we have good contrast between the background colors and our text color. Okay, so again, we're thinking about, we're on a smaller screen, okay, so we want that text to be readable, easy to read. Using common typefaces, you know, like Arial or Georgia, okay. And again, we want to use percentages or M units for our font sizes instead of pixel units. Okay, so this is an important one. This little piece of code we're going to put in all of our pages. Okay, so what this code does is it's kind of the first step to get our pages to load correctly in the mobile. It's called the Viewport Meta Tag. Okay, so our code here, we have meta name equals viewport, content equals width equals device minus width with initial scale 1. Right, so what this does is it, instead of when you load up your page on the browser, if you didn't have this in here, what it's going to do is it's going to try to shrink your entire page to fit on that small browser screen, okay? So you see the picture there on the right side. It basically took that page and it shrunk everything just to that screen size. And so when you do that, then your text is super tiny, the links are tiny. It's kind of useless on a browser. Okay, we don't want people to have to kind of pinch and zoom on their displays on their phones. So we put in this code, and it's kind of that first step. Okay, we're maintaining readable text size and graphics and layout. Okay, so this is the first step. When we gosh dang it, my things getting all messed up here. All right. Okay, so the next step then is now we add in our media queries. All right, so this is an important step. This is where we start to load up our separate style sheets for mobile. Okay, so in our head section, we're telling it to load the mobile style sheet, and with that media equals, we're telling it to load that style sheet when we have max device width of 480 pixels, okay? So with these media queries, we can set kind of our pixel size points for the screen size, and based on those values, we'll load up different style sheets, okay? So think about it, and we have kind of think of it as we have multiple style sheets for multiple screens, but we only have one HTML file. All right, and we'll do a lot of practice with that in our examples. Okay, so you'll get plenty of practice coding that and seeing how that works. So we talked about images and having them to be having those images be flexible. Okay, so again, by using CSS, we can remove the height and width attributes in our HTML, and we're just using the CSS to automatically set our width and height to whatever size the browser screen is. Okay, so we don't have to worry about pixels at that point. We're just letting the screen size determine how big that photo is going to be. So that works pretty well for like the example here where we have that header image. Okay, it just kind of shrinks as the phone shrinks. But again, if you had super tiny text on that graphic, it probably wouldn't work very well in the mobile version. So I just have to be careful about that. So using our responsive images, using a picture element. Okay, so this is a HTML 5.1 element that we can use. And we use this picture element to basically load up different versions of that photo. Okay, so we could have a small version, a medium version, or a large version. And depending on what the width is of the browser, it's going to load up a different JPEG just by whatever screen size is present at the time on the browser. Okay. Another one, we can use sizes and source set attributes. Okay, so we could use this version. Kind of does the same thing. We have our main version there. Okay, the main image source fallback.jpg. Then we type in sizes equals 100 VW. Okay, so we're talking about widths here. And then we, in that source set, okay, then we can add in our, each of our versions, that small, medium, and large JPEG. And then we just add in the width value for the browser window that's kind of tied to each of those. So the first one there is, we load that at 1200 pixels wide. For the medium, we load that at 800 pixel wide. And then if we're loading it up on a small screen, like 320 pixels, we'll load that small JPEG. You'll want to try and test all of your pages to see how they look on the mobile phone. Okay, so you can always load those on your own phone, but it's always good to check them on different versions. Okay. Because we have iOS and we have Android, all right? There's different emulators that you can download and use. There's an iPhone emulator, there's one called Mobilizer. You could also install the iOS or Android software developer kits on your browser. And you can, after you install those, it has an option where you can load pages into kind of an emulator right there on your desktop. And it'll let you see what those look like in iOS or Android native browser window. Okay. One of the last things we're going to talk about here is the Flexbox. Flexboxes use a nice flexible layout. So the nice thing is elements contained within a Flex container, they can be configured either horizontal or vertically, and they kind of do that in a flexible manner for different screen sizes. All right, so there's a web link there that you guys can go to for the different levels of browser support. Pretty much at this point, pretty much all the browsers support Flexboxes, which is good. Okay. Some of the common properties that we use with them are display, the flex direction, the flex wrap, order, justify content. Okay, so if you think of a Flexbox as just kind of a flexible container that basically flexes in and out depending on what the size of the screen is. Okay, so there's an example of the code. Okay, so we set up a ID selector there, and we're putting in the WebKit Flex, and then display flex. And then we have our different flex directions, how we want it to, use our row, depending on how many rows it has, it can kind of shape and shift in size. Okay, so we'll do a couple of coding activities that use the Flexbox. It's a pretty nice tool. It's once you see the code in action, see how it works, it's something that you'll probably want to use quite a bit, because you can kind of be able to kind of the way it works is you can set up these number of columns that are contained within a container, and then by using those columns, different column widths, it will automatically readjust on the browser. Okay, so it'll make sense a lot better when we pull up the code and actually use that and see it in action in the browser. Grid, this is another one using a grid layout. Okay, so these are common properties that we kind of use within that Flexbox. Okay, so again, we can use a grid grid container, and we have different. So we have to use a little bit of math when we start using these, because we have to figure out the number of pixels for our different rows and columns, and we have to kind of figure out how many columns we're going to use in the browser when it's in the mobile view versus the desktop view. But the nice thing is that the code here kind of does all of the resizing for us. Okay, so instead of like some of our media queries where we have a specific pixel amount, like say at 320 pixels, we're going to load up this certain style sheet. By using the Flexbox and the grid, we kind of take out those variables and let it. There's a lot more flexibility. Okay. Last couple of things here, debugging tips for our CSS. Again, use the validator, configure temporary background colors, temporary borders. Somebody asked about comments. Again, that's a good thing to use our CSS comments when we're coding, if we're working on a team. Also, if you're going out and just looking at kind of open source code, you can look at the comments there, because it kind of, a lot of times, especially when we're doing stuff with like flex boxes and the grids and things like that, the comments can be pretty helpful. Okay, so the main thing is just be patient. It's a lot of this, it takes a little bit of trial and error. Okay, so when we start coding, you might not get it to work and look correctly the first time. That's okay. It just, after a few times of doing this, you know, with the responsive coding, it'll get easier. Once you see it in action, it'll also make a lot more sense. So that's it for today. So we're about out of time. So I'll post this in Canvas for you guys to review. Read through chapter 7 in the book. And then on Wednesday, we'll zoom in and we'll start doing some of the coding for this stuff. Okay. All right, that's all I got today. Everybody have a good afternoon, and we'll see you all on Wednesday. See ya.